The dust of the plains caked Ilara's worn dress, a second skin of shame and apprehension, each mile marker a testament to the life she was leaving and the terrifying unknown she rode towards. The carriage wheels groaned a mournful song that echoed the hollow ache in her chest, a rhythm of despair that had been her constant companion since her uncle, his eyes glinting with a cruelty she had only recently come to fully understand, had sealed her fate with a letter and a dismissive wave. He'd called it an arrangement, a chance, but the servant girls hushed. Pitying whispers had painted a different picture, a joke, a slight, a mail-order bride sent to a reclusive man sight unseen, a woman deemed too substantial, too much, for any respectable suitor in their small, judgmental town. Now, the town of Redemption Gulch, if it could even be called that, rose from the heat haze like a collection of forgotten bones bleached by an unforgiving sun, its name a bitter irony to a woman who felt beyond any form of salvation. Her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, were damp despite the arid air, the cheap fabric of her reticule worn smooth by her anxious grip. Inside, a single, cherished locket, her mother's, was the only tether to a past that felt increasingly distant, a dream almost forgotten. He was waiting by the dilapidated structure that served as a stagecoach stop, a figure carved from the very granite of the surrounding bluffs, tall and weathered, his face shadowed by the brim of a battered hat. Silas Blackwood. The name itself felt like a premonition of bleakness. Ilara's breath hitched, she braced for the inevitable curl of his lip, the thinly veiled disgust, the outright rejection that would send her spiraling into a chasm of public humiliation from which there would be no return. He simply watched her descent from the carriage, his gaze direct, unblinking, an assessment devoid of the leering curiosity or disdain she had come to expect. It was an unnerving stillness, a quiet intensity that was perhaps worse than open scorn, for it offered no immediate answers, no clear path for her fear. His eyes, the color of a winter sky before a storm, met hers, and for a fleeting second, she saw not derision, but a profound, hollow weariness that mirrored her own. "The wagon's this way," he said, his voice a low rumble, like distant thunder, devoid of inflection. No mention of her size, her appearance, the whispered rumors that must have preceded her like carrion birds. Hope, a fragile, trembling thing, dared to flutter in the desolate landscape of her heart. Was this it? Was this the man who might, against all odds, see beyond the shell, beyond the cruel pronouncements of others? The silence on the short journey to his cabin, nestled at the foot of a stark, windswept mesa, was thick enough to choke on, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the sigh of the wind through sparse, stubborn pines. The cabin itself was a reflection of the man, solitary, austere, built for endurance rather than comfort. It was clean, meticulously so, but devoid of any softness, any sign of a life lived with joy. Inside, he gestured towards a rough-hewn table. "Food's there." Water. His movements were economical, his presence filling the small space without any deliberate effort. "Parson will be by in the morning." The words hung in the air, a practical statement of fact, yet they sealed her fate as surely as any ironclad contract. He offered her shelter, a share of his meager provisions, a stark kind of respect that was, in its own way, more than she had dared to expect. That first night, huddled beneath a threadbare quilt on a narrow cot, fear was a cold companion, but it was not the only presence in the room. In the profound silence of Silas Blackwood's cabin, with the wind howling outside like a hungry wolf, Ilara sensed not revulsion from the man in the other room, but an almost unnerving neutrality, a space where, perhaps, she might finally be allowed to simply be. The air was thin, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she could almost breathe. The parson, a gaunt man with eyes that seemed to have witnessed too much of the frontier's harshness, arrived with the pale morning light, his Bible clutched like a shield against the world's uncertainties. The ceremony was brief, the words spoken into the chilly air of the cabin felt more like an inventory of legal obligations than a sacred vow. Silas stood beside her, his posture unyielding, his responses clipped but clear. He was a man of his word, that much was apparent, but his heart remained a distant, fortified territory. Ilara felt the weight of the arrangement settle upon her, a transaction completed, yet there was no cruelty in his demeanor, only that vast, echoing emptiness she had glimpsed upon her arrival. Afterward, as the parson made his equally swift departure, Silas laid out the terms of their new existence, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "This is your home now, Ilara," he stated, the use of her name a small, almost imperceptible softening. You'll have your duties. I'll have mine. He gestured vaguely towards the small garden plot, the chicken coop, the interior of the cabin that was now ostensibly hers to manage. He wasn't unkind, but his emotional distance was a wall, solid and imposing. Elara, however, was no stranger to duty, nor to hard work. She had not been raised a delicate bloom, but a practical, capable woman, her hands familiar with toil despite the veneer of gentility her uncle had insisted upon. She set about her tasks with a quiet determination, tending the struggling vegetables, mending Silas's worn shirts with neat, precise stitches, coaxing a reluctant fire to life in the hearth each morning. Her movements were efficient, her presence gradually weaving itself into the fabric of the desolate homestead. Silas watched her, often from the periphery, his observation subtle, almost imperceptible. He saw the strength in her shoulders as she carried water from the creek, the gentle way she coaxed the chickens, the quiet dignity with which she bore her new, uncertain life. He had not known such unassuming competence, such quiet fortitude, in a woman for many, many years, not since Sarah. The thought of his late wife was a familiar stab of pain, one he quickly suppressed. Their first trip to Redemption Gulch for supplies was an ordeal Elara had dreaded. The stares began the moment their wagon creaked down the dusty main street, followed by the inevitable whispers, insidious and sharp, cutting through the thin veneer of her composure. That's Blackwood's mail order. Heard she was a substantial lord. What was he thinking? Each murmured comment was a fresh barb, reopening old wounds. Elara felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks, the urge to shrink, to disappear, but she met their gazes with a carefully constructed neutrality, her chin held a fraction higher than necessary. It was then that a kind voice cut through the hostility. Martha, the town's widowed postmistress, a woman with eyes as warm and knowing as a summer afternoon, offered a small, genuine smile. "Welcome to Redemption, dear," she said, her voice carrying a gentle authority that momentarily silenced the gossips. Later, as Elara sorted through bolts of calico, Martha leaned in. "Don't you mind them, child. Silas Blackwood is a good man, a fine man. Just broken by sorrow. Give him time. And give yourself grace." Her words were a balm to Elara's raw spirit. As they were leaving, a loutish man by the saloon doorway made a crude remark about Silas's prize. Before Elara could even flinch, Silas stopped. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a threat. He simply turned, his gaze like chips of ice, and stared the man down until he stammered an apology and retreated into the shadows. "She's my wife," Silas stated, his voice low but carrying an undeniable finality that brooked no further argument. The words, so simple, so declarative, wrapped around Elara like an unexpected shield. That night, sitting by the dying embers of the fire, the silence in the cabin felt different, less charged with unspoken anxieties. Elara found herself thinking of her uncle, Jebediah, his smug, calculating face. He had orchestrated this, not as a match, but as a humiliation. He'd used her modest dowry to settle his own debts, then, eager to be rid of the niece whose very presence was a reminder of his own failings and her parents' tragic death, he'd concocted this cruel scheme. The joke was meant to be twofold, to demean her so thoroughly that no one would question his actions, and to see Silas Blackwood, a man known for his pride, reject her, thus absolving Jebediah of any further responsibility. He had underestimated Silas, and perhaps, he had underestimated her too. The first frost arrived with a biting wind that swept down from the high peaks, a stark reminder of the looming winter and the precariousness of their existence on this unforgiving land. A sickness took hold of their small flock of sheep, a cough that quickly turned to fever, threatening their already meager chances of surviving the cold months with any surplus to trade. It was a crisis that demanded immediate, unrelenting effort from them both. Day and night, they worked side by side, Elara proving her mettle in ways that went beyond domestic chores. She didn't shrink from the grim task of tending the sick animals, her touch surprisingly gentle yet firm, her resolve unwavering even as one after another succumbed. Silas, initially moving with his usual solitary efficiency, found himself increasingly aware of her presence, not as an assistant, but as a partner. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, yet she met each new dawn with a quiet determination that mirrored his own, albeit without the bitter edge of his grief. One evening, As they shared a scant meal of broth and stale bread, the weariness hanging heavy between them, Silas spoke, his voice raspy. "Lost a flock like this once before," he said, staring into the fire. "With Sarah and little Tim." The names were ghosts on his lips, spoken with a raw pain that made Ilara's heart ache in sympathy. It was the first time he had willingly offered even a fragment of his past. She didn't press, sensing the fragility of the moment, the immense effort it had cost him. Instead, she simply nodded, her silence a vessel for his unspoken sorrow. The crisis, though devastating to their livestock, had forged a new dynamic between them. The heavy silence that had once defined their cohabitation began to soften, replaced by a more companionable quiet, punctuated by the necessities of their shared labor. Silas began to observe Ilara with a different kind of attention. He noticed the way the firelight caught the auburn tints in her hair when she bent over her mending, the determined set of her jaw when she wrestled with a stubborn root in the garden, the rare, fleeting smile that touched her lips when one of the barn cats brushed against her skirts. He found himself thinking that Martha had been right. There was a strength in Ilara that was more than just physical endurance. It was a resilience of the spirit, a quiet grace that had somehow weathered the storms of her own life. "You have a good hand with things," he said one afternoon, watching her patiently nurse a sickly calf back to a semblance of health. Coming from Silas, the words were a profound compliment, and Ilara felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the sun. The calf, a small, innocent creature, became an unwitting catalyst. Ilara's gentle care for it, her soft murmurs of encouragement, seemed to chip away at another layer of Silas's reserve. He found himself lingering in the barn, offering gruff advice that was, in its own way, an expression of shared concern. Martha, during Ilara's next visit to town, filled in more of Silas's story, her words painting a picture of a man hollowed out by unimaginable loss. A fever, swift and brutal, had claimed his wife and son years ago, leaving him a shell of the vibrant man he once was. He blamed himself, though there was nothing he could have done, Martha said, her eyes sad. Built that cabin like a tomb, shut himself away from everyone. Taking a mail-order bride, Ilara, that was an act of desperation, I reckon. A last, grim attempt to fill the emptiness, though I doubt he expected anything more than a housekeeper. Ilara listened, a compassion for this wounded man deepening. He had not sought a partner to share his life, but a presence to mitigate the crushing weight of his solitude. Yet, in her, he was perhaps finding something he hadn't dared to hope for, something he didn't even know he needed. She, in turn, was discovering that beneath the layers of grief and isolation, Silas Blackwood possessed a core of honor and a capacity for a profound, if buried, tenderness. The fortress of his grief was still formidable, but Ilara thought she could see, faintly, the outline of a gate. The biting winds of late autumn carried more than just the promise of snow. They heralded the arrival of a menace Ilara had hoped to leave far behind. Jebediah Thorne, her uncle, materialized on their doorstep like a carrion crow drawn by the scent of perceived misery, his presence an immediate blight on the fragile peace Ilara and Silas had begun to cultivate. He wasn't alone. A pair of brutish-looking men, clearly hired for intimidation, flanked him, their expressions as unpleasant as their masters. Jebediah's smile was a thin, cruel slash across his face as he surveyed the modest cabin, his gaze lingering on Ilara with open disdain before flicking dismissively to Silas. "Well, well, niece," he drawled, his voice oozing false concern. "Came to see how you were settling in. And to offer my condolences to Mr. Blackwood here. Didn't expect you to actually go through with it, Blackwood. Thought a man of your reputed discernment would have more refined taste." The insult, aimed squarely at Ilara's appearance and Silas's judgment, hung in the cold air. Several townsfolk, drawn by the arrival of strangers and the scent of conflict, had begun to gather at a respectful distance, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. This was Redemption Gulch, after all, where dramas unfolded with a stark, public intensity. Ilara felt the old shame threaten to engulf her, the familiar sting of humiliation. But then, she felt Silas shift beside her, a subtle movement, yet it grounded her. She straightened her shoulders, the lessons of quiet dignity learned in this harsh land fortifying her resolve. "This is my home, Uncle Jebediah," she said, her voice clear and steady, surprising even herself. "And this is my husband." The possessive pronouns were a declaration, a line drawn in the unforgiving dust. Silas, who had been a study in granite stillness, slowly turned his head towards Jebediah. The air around him seemed to crackle with a sudden, dangerous energy. The emptiness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, protective fury that Elara had never witnessed. It was the look of a man who had lost everything once and would not stand idly by while the little he had regained was threatened. I was led to believe, Jebediah continued, oblivious or perhaps reveling in the rising tension, that this entire arrangement was something of a jest. A way to solve a rather inconvenient family problem. Surely, Blackwood, you can see the humor in it. A man like you, saddled with, he gestured vaguely at Elara. That was when Silas moved. Not quickly, but with a deliberate intensity that was far more menacing than any sudden outburst. He stepped slightly in front of Elara, a human shield. His voice, when he finally spoke, was no longer the low rumble she was accustomed to. It was harder, sharper, each word a carefully aimed stone. There is no jest here, Thorn, Silas stated, his gaze unwavering. Only a woman of worth, and a man who is fortunate to call her his wife. Jebediah scoffed, a truly ugly sound. Worth? Look at her, man. They sent you a bride too fat to marry off decently, a burden passed on as a cruel prank. The townsfolk murmured, some shocked, some perhaps secretly agreeing. Elara's heart pounded. This was the moment of ultimate humiliation, the public unveiling of her deepest shame. But then Silas spoke, and his words, simple and profound, shattered the oppressive atmosphere. He looked not at Jebediah, but directly at Elara, his eyes, those stormy winter skies, now holding a warmth that reached deep into her soul. They sent me what they called a too fat bride as a joke, Silas declared, his voice ringing with absolute conviction, loud enough for every witness to hear. He then turned his gaze back to Jebediah, cold and dismissive. I call her the most beautiful woman alive. More spirit, more courage, and more heart than a sniveling coward like you could comprehend in 1,000 lifetimes. A collective gasp went through the onlookers. Elara felt tears spring to her eyes, not of shame, but of an overwhelming, incandescent gratitude. Jebediah's face contorted with rage and disbelief. You're a fool, Blackwood, he spat. She's made you a laughingstock. The only fool I see, Silas countered, his hand subtly resting on the worn axe handle leaning against the cabin wall, is a man who traveled many miles to prove his own pettiness. You'll leave my land. Now. And you will not speak my wife's name again. There was no room for negotiation in his tone. Jebediah's hired thug shifted uneasily, looking from Silas's unyielding stance to the suddenly less neutral faces in the crowd. Martha, her arms crossed, nodded approvingly at Silas. One of the gruffer townsmen spat on the ground near Jebediah's feet. The tide had turned. Defeated, his cruel game exposed and his authority completely undermined, Jebediah Thorn uttered a string of curses, then, with a final venomous glare, turned and signaled his men. They mounted their horses and rode away, their departure as ignominious as their arrival had been arrogant, leaving behind a silence thick with unspoken emotions and the dawning of a new respect for the quiet man and his surprisingly resilient wife. The dust settled slowly in the wake of Jebediah's ignominious retreat, leaving Silas and Elara standing before their cabin, the eyes of Redemption Gulch still upon them, though now filled with a different kind of curiosity, respect, and perhaps even a touch of awe. Silas waited until the last of the townsfolk began to disperse, offering quiet nods of acknowledgement, before he turned fully to Elara. The fury had drained from him, leaving behind a profound weariness, but also an openness she had never seen before. The air between them thrummed with unspoken words, with the raw, potent aftermath of his declaration. Elara's hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer emotional force of what had transpired. Silas, she began, her voice barely a whisper, choked with emotion, you truly. She couldn't finish the sentence, the question too vulnerable, the hope too immense. He closed the small distance between them, his calloused hand reaching out, not for her arm, but for her hand. His fingers, strong and work-roughened, gently, tentatively, intertwined with hers. It was a touch more eloquent than any poetry, a bridge across the chasm of their individual solitudes. I see all of you, Elara, he said, his voice rough, imbued with a depth of feeling that made her breath catch. Every part. The strength you try to hide, the kindness you offer so freely, the courage that shines from you even when you're afraid. And it is good. It is more than good. He paused, his gaze searching hers, the winter in his eyes finally, truly, beginning to thaw. For years, he confessed, the words costing him, yet flowing with a new, hard-won freedom, this place, my life, it was all barren. Like this land before the rains. I was a shadow. You, Ilara, you brought the rain. Tears streamed freely down Ilara's cheeks now, but they were tears of release, of a profound, healing joy. And you, Silas, she managed, her voice thick, you gave me shelter from a storm I thought would never end. You saw me. When no one else ever bothered to look, he raised her hand, still clasped in his, and brushed his lips against her knuckles, a gesture of such unexpected tenderness that it stole her remaining breath. It was not the kiss of a husband bound by duty, but of a man awakening to love, a love earned through shared hardship, mutual respect, and the quiet unfolding of two souls finding solace in one another. The wall around Silas Blackwood's heart, built of grief and isolation, did not just crack, it crumbled, and in its place, something new and vital began to grow. The wary community of Redemption Gulch, having witnessed the unwavering loyalty and profound connection between Silas and Ilara, welcomed them without reservation. The whispers ceased, replaced by nods of respect and offers of friendship. Martha beamed like a proud mother hen, her faith in Silas, and now in Ilara, vindicated. Months turned into a season, then a year. The Blackwood homestead, once so stark and silent, began to reflect the changes in its inhabitants. Ilara's flower patch, started with a few stubborn seeds she'd brought with her, now bloomed with a vibrant array of colors against the cabin wall, a splash of defiant beauty in the rugged landscape. Laughter, a sound rarely heard before, now echoed from within its walls, light and genuine. Silas's face, though still etched with the sorrows of his past, now held a new softness, his eyes frequently warmed by a smile as he watched Ilara move about their shared life. He was no longer a ghost haunting his own existence, he was present, alive, anchored by the love he had found in the most unexpected of circumstances. Ilara, in turn, blossomed under the steady light of his affection and the security of their home. The shame that had once clung to her like a shroud was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence, a radiant inner peace that emanated from her like warmth from a hearth. Her beauty, once obscured by societal cruelty and her own fear, now shone undeniable, a testament to a spirit unbent and a heart made whole. One crisp autumn morning, as the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves filled the air, Ilara stood with Silas by the creek, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. Her hand lay possessively, protectively, over the gentle swell of her belly, a silent promise of new life, of a future filled with hope. The land, once a symbol of their isolation and hardship, now seemed to cradle them, its stark beauty a fitting backdrop for their resilient love. The journey had been arduous, fraught with pain and uncertainty, but they had weathered it together. They had found in each other not just a spouse, but a partner, a confidant, a true home for their weary hearts. The world had sent Silas Blackwood what it deemed a joke, a cast-off, a burden. But he, with eyes unclouded by prejudice and a heart capable of recognizing true worth, had seen a queen. And in his love, Ilara had found her crown, proving that the truest beauty is not a matter of outward form, but a reflection of the strength, courage, and love that reside within the soul. Their story became a quiet legend in Redemption Gulch, a reminder that even in the harshest of terrains, love could take root and flourish, transforming desolation into abundance, and proving that sometimes, the greatest treasures are found where one least expects them, not in perfection, but in the profound acceptance of an unbroken spirit. What one person deems flawed, another may see as the very essence of what makes life worth fighting for, a testament to the idea that true sight comes not from the eyes, but from a heart willing to see beyond the surface, into the very soul of another.